Good afternoon. My name is Avinoam Pat. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life here at the University of Connecticut. And it's my pleasure to have the honor of welcoming you today for this very special program with Professor Marla Brettschneider, The Jew as Queer and Intersectional Approach. In a moment, I will turn the program over to my wonderful colleague, Sherry Zane, who's the Interim Director of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at the University of Connecticut, to offer welcoming remarks to our distinguished speaker today. But I just want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for today's program. In addition to the Center for Judaic Studies, UConn Hillel, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at the University of Connecticut, the Philosophy Department, the Political Science Department, and the Rainbow Center. So thank you to all of our wonderful co-sponsors for today's program. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we gather here today, both physically and virtually, and I actually am in my office at the Dodd Center, so I'm actually on this land, is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pawcasset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples who have stewarded this land through the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Now, I'm very excited for our speaker today, Professor Marla Brettschneider, who's going to be speaking on the Jew as Queer and Intersectional Approach. And I just want to mention a couple of technical things before I turn the program over to my colleague, Sherry Zane. Professor Brettschneider is going to give her lecture, and we encourage Q&A and discussion. And so please, as she's speaking, if you think of questions that come up, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to type them in, and then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion at the end of the talk today. And I also want to mention that today's program is being captioned. So if you want to use the closed captioning function on the bottom of your screen, there is the CC button, and you can click the CC button and have it captioned for you. So thank you so much also to our captioner for being here today. So with those announcements, I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Sherry Zane, to offer words of introduction.
Thank you so much, Avi. And I would also like to give a special thanks to Avi Pat, who introduced himself as the director for the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. If it were not for Avi, I don't know if I would be sane right now. So I really appreciate Avi being on top of everything, and to our wonderful program assistants for all the behind the scenes work that they did to get the event out there and to make sure that people had the correct registration link and whatnot. So thank you to them as well. So before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would just like to say that in the beginning, when we welcome, usually when we're in person, people clap to welcome, or at the end of a talk, they clap. If you don't want to turn off your mute button to clap because of other noise in your background, you can do the sign language for applause is to do this. And so it also just looks really cool on the gallery view to see everybody doing this. So feel free to engage that way as well. Okay, so I would like to, it is my pleasure and honor also to introduce you to Dr. Marla Brettschneider, who is a professor of political theory at the University of New Hampshire with a joint appointment in political science and women's and gender studies. Dr. Brettschneider founded and worked with the UNH Queer Studies, Critical Race Studies, Religious Studies, and Social Justice Leadership programs. Dr. Brettschneider does Jewish diversity politics and political theory, working at the nexus of Jewish, feminist, queer, critical race, class-based, and decolonial theories. So she does a lot. She is the author of numerous special issues of academic journals and many award-winning books, including Jewish Feminism and Intersectionality, The Family Flamboyant, Race Politics, Queer Families, Jewish Lives, The Narrow Bridge, Jewish Views on Multiculturalism with a foreword by Cornel West, and The Jewish Phenomenon in Sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Brettschneider has co-edited a primary queer studies text for political science, LGBTQ Politics, A Critical Reader, as well as numerous queer theory works and journal special editions. So please join me in welcoming the fabulous Marla Brettschneider.
Thank you. You're so sweet. It has been lovely to work with Sherry, Zane, and also with Avi Pat. Thank you to all the organizations, offices, and institutes, and all the support people, and the Phil Department, Political Science, Lewis Gordon, Jane Gordon, all of you great folks, the Rainbow Center. And we will be getting folks in your critical race studies and Africana, African, across the Atlantic, and African diaspora studies, et cetera, because this kind of talk is, I would say it's where they all come together. And so on the one hand, Sherry's so sweet, she says, that's a lot. On the other hand, when you start with the presumption that all of these co-construct one another, different way to say intersectional, when you start from the basis of these multiple critical theories, it's not so much that it's a lot, it's just kind of your base and it's what you do. So hopefully we're all gonna learn, I'm gonna continue to learn to do this better. And I get to do that by being in community with folks like you. I would have loved to have done this in person. I think we all would have, but thank you so much for adapting and figuring out the tech to make it happen. Okay, so the focus of our time together is for me to offer this analysis in the frame that I've shared, which I've called the Jew as queer. And it's not that I necessarily make that up, but I do it in my own way. And so to do so, I'm going to speak to you today about a few different sorts of LGBTQ Jewish matters. Some ways we'll cover a lot of ground, but even so, obviously we only have so much time, and there will be time in the Q&A, et cetera. We can study together another time, and I'm sure you have lots of great resources at UConn. So I'm going to start, you know, they often say, assume an educated audience. At the same time, my experience is that most folks, when I come to communities like UConn, not just UConn, but people actually have very little exposure to the sort of Jewish background or even the Jewish angles on the things that they're working on generally. So at the risk a little bit of telling a few of you things that you might already know, I'm going to do a little bit of background for things you might want to know about Jews historically, and that'll include the discussion that I'm presenting for the talk title, The Jew as Queer. And then if we want to bring it up and to look at how this plays out in terms of contemporary politics or activism, we can do that too. And I forgot to ask, someone is just gonna, whenever you want me to stop, someone's gonna maybe give me a 10-minute heads up, come back to the world, Marla, you've been in your head now for 40 minutes kind of thing. So that will be helpful. I'm keeping my own time, but of course, that's always helpful. Okay, so to get acquainted just very briefly with some basic ancient Jewish LGBTQ information. If we have time, we'll see what we want to do more to remind you all that Jews are transnational people with tremendous racial diversity globally and also within the United States. There are many organized Jewish movements, both religious and civic. Almost all of them, this is a big conversation for another time, but almost all ordain LGBTQ clergy and actively work for LGBTQ rights and inclusion around the globe, although there are some exceptions, and of course there's always politics and dynamics. So one, to just give you some basic background, which will set, the most important thing for today is, I don't want to pretend that there's some Archimedean point totally outside of modern Western Christianity, but at the same time, the point of diversity issues is that not everyone is the same. So to identify some specific areas in which Jews are outside of modern Christian heteronormativity for today's talk, which is, it's going to connect to the concept of the Jew as queer and the concept for Jews in the modern. I'm a little hesitant, I have to be honest, and I wrote Sherry and Avi a note last night. I'm a little, because I'm a theorist, I like to construct a really clean argument. I'm a little hesitant that by giving you some background and showing how, in the large ways, Jewish matters are actually different from hegemonic Western modern Christian notions, that somehow you're going to then blame my whole Jew as queer notion on, well, Jews are actually different. And there's a way in which Jews are actually different, but that's not exactly what the argument about the Jewish queer is about. So at the risk of having that be a little confusing, we can take that up later. I'm going to do it because I do think people probably need some very basic introduction. So in terms of Jewish ancient tradition, in terms of prohibitions, or how does ancient Jewish tradition imagine what we today would call LGBTQ lives, just spend a little bit of time on this. Most folks don't have a basic exposure to LGBTQ life issues in our diversity historically and today. And so, for example, there's almost no scriptural basis for banning same gender sexual activity, despite what you hear from the right and the religious right. First off, what we might call today lesbianism is not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is important to Christianity and to Christians, but also we're going to talk about that as important as the Hebrew Bible is to Jews, the Hebrew Bible isn't, even in some ways we could argue, I don't want to be misleading, it's not the main text of ancient Jewish life, but even so, there's very little in the Hebrew Bible, and there's nothing in the Hebrew Bible that refers to what today we might call lesbianism. The line that probably some people know of or aware of, this Leviticus 18 verse 22, is taken today to expressly forbid male-to-male sexual activity, and as a capital crime. And plenty of other people have argued, so I'm just going to present who know a lot more than I do, that's basically, it's a significant overreach in terms of the contemporary interpretation of that line. So there's much to be said on that subject. It's not the focus of our talk today, but to be brief, to say that a man will not lie with another man as he would a woman. From today's perspective, of course, we call into question the whole gender designation of these categories, men and women. And to the degree that we even will accept a gender binary, which I'm going to show you in a minute, doesn't even sort of fully operate in a Jewish paradigm. For decades, scholars have been saying that, well, gay men, and of course, there's lots of different ways to be a gay man, but for the most part, gay men are saying, I'm not a gay man, so I'm sharing with you what colleagues say to me, that they're not lying with other men as they would with a woman. They identify as gay, so that's the point. They're being sexual with other men. That's the point. It's not as with a woman. So anyway, there's a lot that we can talk about in there. And also this brief mention in Torah, or the Jewish Bible, doesn't correspond to what we today would understand as gay or homosexual contours of people's lives, certainly in modernity. It's not about desire. It's not about identity. It's not about community. At most, it is about a specific act, though even that reference to a specific act, I'm being kind of incredibly generous because the reference is quite vague. What is the act? Who are the actors? They're both skewed in a tremendous way that in some ways can make it hard to have them make sense and apply today. But moving up from the biblical period, when that was referenced about 1000 to 165 BCE, there are some later, again, I'm just going to do this very briefly, there are some later mentions in Talmud, which is more generally like the solid Jewish textual grounding, what is called the rabbinic period, which runs roughly, anyone can debate me, about 165 BCE to about 900 AD. And then there's a little bit more from the Middle Ages, about 900 to 1700. I hope I'm not going too fast. I'm just trying to give you a brief overview. There is, for example, one discussion of female homoerotic behavior in that medieval area found in a compilation of laws called the Mishnah Torah. And they're written by the legal scholar and philosopher Moses Maimonides in the 12th century. So there is some scant reference to things we might take interest of as contemporary queer and LGBTQ studies. But it's not nearly as obvious as sometimes people are led to believe. And certainly if you just come from a sort of general or dominant Christian paradigm in the United States to what are the Jewish paradigms. Another section I'm going to do as part of the introduction to lead us up to the segment of the talk, which is the Jewish queer. Again, taking a risk of giving you this background and then confusing the argument is I have to just remind you, because I think for the most part, people are not aware of what are Jewish gender norms. So contemporary queer and trans activism and scholarship have been propelled in large part by a critique of modern Western Christian binary thinking. In this case, for example, that there are two genders operating in a dichotomous frame. And some folks have looked at an array of non-Christian or non-Western or non-modern cultures that operate, for example, with more than two genders. And there's some scholarship on that. And when I teach undergraduates and graduate students in queer studies, they're a little bit familiar with this community or some Native American communities or this community in Asia. People in the US most often don't really know anything about Jewish life and history. And so Jewish examples about this gender binary and work living beyond outside of this gender binary are rarely explored as alternatives to hegemonic modes of modern Christian Western life. And again, I'm just going to say the very briefest here to some of you who know a lot. I'm probably going to do a terrible job, and some of you for whom this is super new, and we should talk more another time. So there are actually something like 6 or 8 gendered categories in the Talmud. So these are ancient. This isn't like hip queer people down on, in the West Village going, hey, we're multi-binary, we're not in the binary, which gotta love those people too. But these are ancient categories, as I've shared with you. So there are some gender categories we'll call in the gender frame that some of you may be familiar with, like men and women. Okay. But there are actually like about at least another 6 gender categories in traditional Jewish ancient texts, one called an androgynous, one called a tumtum. These are people who, these refer to genitalia and the relationship to what might be constructed as gender. There are folks designated as saris or islanot. And I'm not going to go into all of these, but these are freely discussed in our ancient Jewish texts. And then there are subcategories of the saris kama and the saris adam and the islanot. So the point is that Mishnaic rabbis were apt to privilege maleness in the case of indeterminate or multiple genders. So one thing I want to remind you, when you look at cultures outside of the dominant, sometimes when people want to find these cultures outside of the Western modern Christian binary, then somehow it's as if that takes care of all the problems of of oppression and patriarchy if you just find a community that doesn't work on a binary. I've written elsewhere about the need on the one hand to look at really alternative paradigms to hegemonic and dominant ones, and then things that you have to really watch out for to not make a bunch of mistakes of suddenly imagining that everyone else is just, fine. So it's important to note that different constructions of what today we'll call gender and conceptualizations that don't rely on hierarchically paired binaries don't necessarily mean that systems such as patriarchy or heteronormativity don't operate. Okay, so they still can. Where we are by now, so used to bringing down a gender binary as a problem of binaries without noting that sometimes its construction works only in certain times and places in a larger context of power and politics. Like we're talking here in the Christian West, you can have a non-gender binary system that doesn't miraculously solve the problems of heteropatriarchy. So I do love the Jewish example for that reason for us to study as well. And noting this, I think will help us learn not only about the multi-use of cultural forms of gender, but also better interrogate the ways that binaries do work in the modern Christian West. And so looking at alternative examples is also helpful. Okay, I hope that that's enough, because now I really want to get to our main subject for today's lecture, the Jew as queer, which I've called an intersectional approach. And I have written on intersectionality and Jewish feminism and intersectionality. And what I often mean by that is co-construction or mutually constitutive theory or multivalent. So in this part of the talk, we're going to explore Jewish queer theory through the co-constructed frames of race, gender, sexuality, and class. And a bit we can situate it in terms of decolonial thought. Now, scholars in the field of Jewish queer studies have been examining this subject for decades. There's a version of this, of the Jewish queer, that far precedes me. I learned it from all these folks who came before me. Recently, I'm going to now switch, that's Jewish studies. Now, if we go out sort of outside of Jewish studies, there are a lot of scholars in fields that have begun to do this, also this kind of queered analysis in a variety of other marginalized communities, Latinx populations and immigrants in the US, refugees and asylum seekers, indigenous populations, Muslims, Arabs, South Asians. And these studies also often cross-cut with queered analysis of the historically constructed category of terrorist, which of course is important for all of us today, and of course has great import for Jewish studies today. However, as often happens, there's a way in which these different kinds of studies and disciplines don't end up always making the most of each other and connecting. So these blossoming subfields in these other marginalized areas of studies and activism don't generally take into account these Jewish examinations of similar dynamics that have been articulated well and very clearly in numerous works since at least the 1990s. So what we need to do, what my scholarship does, and what I'm going to be trying to bring you along, is that we need to bring together these cutting edge interdisciplinary studies to widen the scope of critical diversity theories, as well as Jewish and even Jewish queer studies. And hopefully doing some of this work today, UConn, all you folks, students, faculty, community members, will then be able to bring your interdisciplinary work into a Jewish studies frame as it supports all of you in bringing a Jewish lens into the rest of your studies in related fields across campus. So we need to bring together the sort of work that has long been done in Jewish studies on the Jew as queer, with the sort of analyses being done in diversity studies across marginalized communities. And that's what I get to do. Like the kind of Jew as queer analysis I'm going to offer today is not the same as the kind of analysis that was offered in these very important pivotal books in the 1990s. So today we're going to look at the frameworks for constructing Jews as non-white, as whiteness is being created in the European imagination, in the Christian West as it moves into modernity. And we're going to also note that defining Jews racially as outside the nations, meaning in these terms as racially other, is itself a gendered, sexed, classed, and colonial project of Christianity at this time, and of course, which we're still engaged in. And so hopefully what we're going to be doing is being able to bring into relief most helpfully with this multivalent, or you might say intersectional queer analysis. So I know over at UConn, you have great critical race studies, as I said, African, Africana, African diaspora, African American studies. So this discussion of the Jew as queer in the raced way I'm going to present it is inherently related to these simultaneous constructions of the Jew as Black or non-white in Christian Europe moving into modernity, as Europe and as Jews as an internal other, as Jewish as European Christian encounters with indigenous Africans as Black, and constructing folks in Africa as Jewish simultaneously. So that in some ways is a little beyond the scope of the talk, but that informs the kind of analysis I'm able to do. And I'm happy to talk about that at another time, the way actually at the same moment, as the creation of Blackness, it's Jews as the internal other in Christian Europe, and then Africans and what they're seeing, what elites are seeing in terms of Jews in Europe. They're seeing these Black Africans, and when they're in Africa, they're seeing these Jews when they're in these communities with indigenous Africans. Okay, so in terms of intersectional analysis of Jews as queer in the European context, couple of reminders. Euro-heritage Jews are a minority of Jews across the globe. It's important we remind that because there's a funny situation of being in the United States. And there are specific reasons for the concentration of Jews in the United States in the past century or so. And that's why there's still this question about race and Jews when the majority of Jews in the United States today are European heritage. But people often make the mistake, they conflate that a majority of US Jews as having Euro heritage. They conflate that with as if the majority of Jews in the world are of Euro heritage, and that can matter. And so also before we move on, then we have to clarify, Okay, yes, we say majority of Jews in the United States today are European heritage, but when we're talking about that majority, we're still talking about 80%, meaning we're still talking about 20% of Jews just in the United States, not only globally, as not identifying in the ways that we talk about as in US racial taxonomies of whiteness or Jewish taxonomies of Ashkenazi, Northern European heritage, et cetera. So that means there are actually still, people don't realize, there's hundreds of thousands of non-Euro Jews in the United States today, even as we all will be impacted by this European history that's grounded in these US Christian hegemonic norms. So what we're going to do today is specifically a raced, classed, gendered, and sexed analysis of a strata of transnational Western Jewish experience to talk about Jews as queer in Western Christendom. And we can also be doing this in a decolonial frame a little bit. So this frame of analysis is central to theorizing the shifting processes of racing and deracing folks, even in the United States, because our legacies come from Europe, even though they're not the same, and certainly ways in the West more broadly, for Jews in particular, but also transnationally throughout the modern West. And the sex, gender, sexuality triad that from queer studies, some people may be familiar with, sex, sexuality, and gender, that triad that in our contemporary time we're a little bit familiar with in our time and place is constitutive of race, as there are other politically salient aspects of identity and structural inequality, for example, like class. So Northern European Jews, again, currently a majority of US Jews, though a minority of Jews globally, were long characterized as outside the boundaries of whiteness created in Western racial taxonomies. And of course, this is still an active issue for many of us. So white gender norms emerge from bourgeois, meaning middle class, it was only neo at the time, capitalism as the development of liberalism, Western and Christian constructions, and they of course have been anything but static. But still they do differ from Western Jewish constructions of race and gender and sexuality. I'm hopefully going to be able to tease those out, each of those strains out, and make that clear. So due in large part to the differences in their construction of race and classed and sexed notions of gender, Jews have historically been seen as queer. And I don't mean any particular Jew and their particular activities, but Jews as a people have been seen as queer in the modern Christian West. So let me show you how that works. Let's take one example, class. So as class is part of the racial construct, we have to remember that gender and sexual norms of whiteness are also often expectations of elite Western Christians that conflict with class-based constructions of race, gender, and sexual orientation amongst even Western Jews. So on class, for example, when we speak of Jews, we're certainly not talking in traditional European terms of elites or aristocracies. Jews were excluded from those marker of being class elites. If we're also talking about landedness, another traditional marker for wealth in European societies, Jews were largely blocked from owning land in Christian Europe. So Jews also have historically acknowledged the political importance of any Jews who may become wealthy, but class as a form of status, privilege, and enfranchisement in decision-making in Jewish communities operated largely differently than it did in hegemonic structures in the modern Christian West. For in Jewish communities, these notions of status, privilege, and enfranchisement were largely a function of learnedness, and the learned were often quite poor. So even Jewish categorizations have had a different history from common European and even Marxist, which is a counter narrative, even Marxist and other economically based Western versions of class. To push this a little bit more, the elite aspiration amongst Jews in this time was generally defined as the ability to study, meaning particularly ancient Jewish religious texts. Now, of course, many Jews probably dreamed of riches. Poverty and disenfranchisement were extreme and they were deadly. But the hegemonic, and we can, if you want to talk about the differences between hegemonic and other modes of living our lives. The hegemonic paradigm of status was full-time study in a religious house of learning. We call it a yeshiva for the Yiddish. Now, this was out of reach for the majority of Jews, both economically and, of course, intellectually. Not everybody could swing being a Talmud scholar. But moving into the period of capitalism, Western Christian notions of manhood came to include this concept of physical prowess and other updated notions where the sort of bourgeois notions take over from chivalry. And what we often see there is that Jewish elite men then consciously reinforced their commitment to manhood through study, purposely through a counter paradigm, not through physical prowess, but through study as their way to define manhood in a Jewish context. So in part to differentiate themselves from their surrounding societies. If you haven't noticed, these are important points, but these are all so far male gender norms, if you haven't caught that. So now we have to complicate that a little bit, because so far that was mostly only relating to men. So now we're going to do gender, race, and class for women, or Jewish women. So, though most Christian women in the West were also poor and engaged in physical labor, the elite Christian association of white womanhood with fairness and a quiet etiquette excluded Jewish women both from the gendered and sexed category of womankind and the Gentile race at the time. And we still have remnants of this. So remember that the race class construct in whiteness of being fair, and a lot of people still use that, oh, you know, she has fair hair or her skin is fair, means that you're light, which is positively valenced, and that valence comes out in all the ways that we also use fair in other ways of fairness, fair and fairness in general, not just about skin tones. So that you're fair as we develop liberal notions of democratic concepts. So it's no coincidence we're going to move from fairness to the concept of Gentile. It's no coincidence exactly that the word Gentile, meaning nationally or racially non-Jewish, came to be etymologically related to the word gentility. Okay, so Gentiles basically are non-Jews, but there's a whole political power dynamic of what gentility means, because it means the status of belonging to the upper class, or the refined behavior or seen as a of the upper class. So of course, although Jewish womanhood was not in the slightest homogeneous, there was a standard elite Jewish expectation of women, corresponding to the aspiration that men should be scholars. And that gendered correlation was that the wives of those scholars should be business people, meaning capable of supporting their households financially. Now, again, let's get a little bit out of that elite strata. Most Jewish families were extremely poor. They needed numerous income earning workers in the household. And of course, within religious settings, which is a little bit different from these mundane or quotidian aspects, in religious settings, Jewish women were expected to be quiet and without a voice. So that's a lovely complication to deal with. But remember that different gender norms, again, as we said before, don't simply mean that patriarchy was gone. Patriarchy can function in numerous ways in different cultures. So Western Christian patriarchy isn't the only way to value groups such as men over groups such as women. However, having said that, I know this is a lot, but yeah, I get to talk for 40 minutes. It's so exciting. Jewish businesswomen were far more common than were Gentile businesswomen. And these Jewish women were generally, or as a cultural norm, enjoyed respect within their communities as conforming to Jewish gender norms. So again, while they were excluded from formal religious settings, Jewish women, due to their business roles, ended up also having what we would call today higher literacy rates than many of their neighboring Gentile women. And if you're interested, we can talk about that later and how that translated into the periods of migration, transnationalism, for example, how matter of literacy still works out for today for women Jewish women in secular societies in the West or in the US in terms of Jews, race, class, sexuality today. So we can talk about that too. All right, let's now move and specifically identify this concept of heteronormativity. So according to the binaries of modern Christendom, European Jewish women appeared mannish and Jewish men appeared feminized. These gendered norms also co-construct heteronormativity. Now, this isn't uncommon even in today's United States, historically for a range of marginalized communities, even if they've become largely Christian, though we do have to take into account the Catholic Protestant thing. Much critical race scholarship, for example, even on African Americans, if you're doing African American studies, you're going to find examines the lived realities of so many where Black men are talked about as being not properly configured as sufficiently masculine in white settler colonial terms, and Black women are configured as masculine. So Jews aren't the only one that get that their gendered concepts and then the heterosexuality of that come into question. When we bring it back to the Jewish example, Christians observed physically weak or effeminate in their views, studious Jewish men and strong, savvy Jewish women who acted independently in the economic sphere in dealing with neighboring Christian communities. And their impressions helped to cast Jews generally as queer, in this case in both sexed and gendered terms, and therefore as threats to heterosexuality. The queer gender of Jews rendered them further suspect as potential sexual perverts, as happens with many marginalized communities. So these perceptions precluded Jews also, therefore, these race and sexed and gendered and class concepts precluded Jews, was part of what the construct that precluded Jews from membership in these sexed, gendered, raced constructs of the European nations as they're developing, and that later become equated with whites. Just to do a little bit more before my time is up. So now we're talking about Jews with queer genders. So as much as Christians consider Jews outside of and threatening to these mutually constituted, socially constructed categories of race, gender, heterosexuality, and class that marked the idea at the time of well-ordered societies in the Christian-dominated West, in ways in which Jews troubled this binary gender framework. They were similarly disturbing to other common norms. So much scholarly work within Jewish studies has been done on the multiple gender categories, as I've shared, within Jewish tradition. And although that happens in Jewish studies, where we can see this significant contrast to hegemonic binary gender systems of modern Western Christianity, Western Christians seeing Jews as queer and therefore as suspect doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with Jewish life in and of itself, and Jewish ancient texts and Jewish self-categorizations. For modern Western Christians, in the ways that Jews just don't fit into the paradigms being developed in hegemonic constructs in modernity, and so we're seen as queer in a pejorative sense, not a contemporary fab queer sense. Presumptions in Western Christian modernity about the matching or alignment of sex, gender, and sexuality only makes sense within these co-constructed binary categories that are used in these dominant ways of modern Western Christianity, presuming that there are two sexes, two genders, and therefore these are seen as opposites and that members of each must attract and mate with their opposites. So Jews muddied these modern Western Christian binaries of gender and sexuality that are co-constructed with race and class disorientations in ways that their neighbors found confusing, if I'm going to try to be kind, and otherwise were deemed as threatening. So what I'm bringing up to is that for hundreds of years, Jews have long troubled Western Christian dominant notions that sex or gender exists or is obvious or only has two forms. And in this arena, also Jews seem to interrupt the seemingly natural and thus logically causal relationship of sex to gender to heterosexuality in modern Western Christendom. So I can stop there, or I can just make some reference to other scholars working in the field. Let me take another few minutes.
Yeah, maybe take a couple minutes just to sort of make those references. And in the meantime, I'll encourage people as they're thinking of questions to type them into the chat so that we're ready to go to Q&A when you wrap up. But please go ahead.
Excellent. So some of the folks in Jewish studies writing in the 1990s, I'd say that they're feminists, but they're not necessarily all writing in the same kind of feminist register. So we had folks like Sandra Gilman in The Jew's Body, 1991, Daniel Boyarin on Heroic Conduct, 1997, Naomi Seidman in A Different Way, A Marriage Made in Heaven, The Sexual Politics of Hebrew and Yiddish, also in 1997. So when I say Jewish studies scholars have been doing this for a long time, you know, that's not even my field of expertise, but there was this cluster of work that was being published in the 1990s on this notion that we can call the Jew as queer. And then since then, you need to move it up then, really quite disconnected from that history of work in Jewish studies, we began then seeing within a decade or so, more scholars, more interesting scholars doing this kind of work, looking at, for example, Latinx immigrants in the United States, the crossover to terrorism. And this is where an example would come up that where this confounding thing for Protestants about the relationship of Catholics comes up. We can talk about that later. And then we can talk about Muslims, Middle Easterners, Arabs, South Asians. Again, with this crossover, we're talking about by now, certainly post 9/11, with this construction of terrorists. So again, they don't all do it in the same way. Two texts that I've really appreciated, Ana Sampaio in 2015, her work Terrorizing Latina and Latino Immigrants, Race, Gender, and Immigration Policy post 9/11. And then we also have C. Heike Schotten in 2018, her work on, or their work, I'm not sure how they self-identify, Queer Terror, Life, Death, and Desire in a Settler Colony. And this, for Schotten, it also crosses specifically with indigeneity. And for example, Sampaio's feminist work could use some of Schotten's work on indigeneity and the queer analysis, and Schotten's work can use some of Sampaio's work. You know, we're all doing what we can. But what I want to remind you in terms of that development, that hasn't those conversations, which are really important, haven't at all been connected to the sort of Jewish ground that people often forget in the period, which still impacts us today in many ways, that in the period of mass immigration of Jews to the United States, which is around the turn of the 20th century, that's the same period where the US Jewish community grows in concentration and shifts its demographic to a Northern European Jewish cultural norm. So some of you know, I've done a lot of work on Emma Goldman as well, looking as a Jewish political theorist from a diversity perspective. And just so Emma Goldman, working at the turn of the 20th century, the US is getting a lot of practice on Jews and Jewish immigrants, and they have this firestorm in Emma Goldman where they get to play out this concept of dangerous woman, terrorist, she's called a terrorist, as a foreigner, an immigrant, a threat, a sexual predator. This is all Jews in general, but it's all played out specifically on Emma Goldman, which is partly why she's so fun. You know, it's awful, but fun to study, that Jews are sexual predators, that Jews ought to be the subject of eugenic solutions, that we're not properly heterosexual, we're not gendered properly, we're criminal just for being, we're dark racially. So the kind of work that, for example, Schotten and Sampaio are doing in the last 10 years or something, assuming all of this about terrorists, darkness, foreigners, threats with a sexual overlay, that these people are sexual predators, should be targeted in eugenics, in colonial genocide, et cetera, has a long history, not only in Europe, but specifically in the United States against Jews. And so in this way, the scholars that are looking at these raced, gendered, sexed, and class, I'll say cultured, because Jewish things aren't always actually religious in a Protestant way, they can take, I would say they can take their work a lot further if we include an understanding of Christian hegemony. And the kind of work that I am basing my stuff on in Jewish studies fantastic colleagues of mine. I could never do the kind of work that they did. I'm not in rabbinics, or I don't do language politics. So I think that if we take seriously the Christian notion of Christian hegemony being in the connection, these folks doing this in a variety of marginalized communities with white settler colonialism, genocide, indigeneity, could really use a lot from the Jewish studies aspect, and the Jewish studies aspect can really use a lot historically and today from looking across, some would say intersectionally, with these multiple ways of these conversations that aren't being had in the same spaces. They're really two separate conversations, even though Jewish studies folks were pumping out books on this in the 1990s. There's now like a whole new field, as if the Jewish work had never been done. Okay, that's a ton. I would really prefer now to hear from all of you.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. So first of all, we'll do our first virtual round of applause for an amazing presentation, and really incredibly compelling and thought-provoking. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you again to Dr. Sherry Zane for really sort of spearheading this invitation, because this is really initiates, I think, a fascinating conversation. We have some excellent questions that are already coming into the chat. So I'm going to start to get to those questions, and I will encourage people, if you have more questions, to please keep typing them in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I think we have about 25, 30 minutes. We have a good amount of time. So, and I'm going to read the questions, but if folks want to add to it, please feel free. If you want to expand to, you can unmute yourself or sort of follow up. So the first question that I see here is from my colleague at UConn Stanford, coordinator of our Judaic Studies program there, Fred Roden. Hi, Fred. So Fred writes in, we've seen the shift from lesbian, gay, Jewish questions circa 50 years ago to Jewish queer questions 30 years ago to the queerness of Jewishness. And so the question is, what would you say are the critical questions for Jewish queer studies now?
Excellent, thank you. I mean, I think the way in conversations with Sherry that Sherry reached out to me and she said, I'm like, well, who are you engaged with? Who are you having conversations with at UConn? Who would you like to be having conversations with that you're not necessarily having? You know, we did a lot of talking before coming up with this as the subject for the today's talk. And I definitely think this is, I think we should be doing whole classes on this for sure, in a lot of ways. This very notion, I think Jewish queer studies has certainly been informed by critical race studies, has been informed by feminism, but there's a lot of way in what happens in Jewish queer studies still is insufficiently able to work not only with a multiplicity of critical paradigms, feminist and queer and class and race and decolonial paradigms, but what does it mean to take them all together as your, in some ways you want to say it's a non-foundation, you know, for theorists, it's a non-foundational blah, 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 but like, I'll use the word for ordinary people as a foundational basis from which to start your studies. So there's been I don't even know exactly what it means when people say siloing. There's been too much siloing. There's, you know, this great person who can do a little bit of queer and do feminist, and the next person does great. The feminist forgets the queer, and the queer forgets the feminist, and hardly any of them are doing sufficient race work, and they're not doing it in a decolonial paradigm, and class drops out. Like, there's so much that can be done by taking these into account and doing, again, I don't really love I'm fine with y'all using the word intersectional, but I would call it mutually constitutive about how things foundationally co-construct one another. So I would just start with just this very talk. There's so much that can and ought to be done. And then there's so many things that can come off it about looking at decolonial work in Jewish queer studies is huge. Taking Jewish studies and trying to have interventions into this magnificent work about that's coming out of these other communities, of this community as queer now, 20 years after the big period of the Jewish one. This community is queer, and that community is queer, and this community is settler colonial. All the settler colonial subjects are queer, like all great. And then like Christian hegemony drops out. Jewish studies has so much to offer. So we've hardly begun, as much as there's so much excellent on feminist and queer and race. We've hardly actually begun on feminist, queer, race, class, and certainly decolonial. And Lewis is amazing. Lewis does so much of this. Lewis and I know that we're different, and I could never do the work that Lewis does. And there's probably certain things that Lewis will tell me, Marla, I could never do the kind of work that you do. And that's just what makes colleagues beautiful. So I hope that's a snapshot of an answer, that there's so much that can be done. And I just want to say, so I have this other book coming out. It's due out in 21 by Routledge, another, and I don't generally, because I was politicized in the New York City, just time and place, in New York City in the 1990s, my paradigm was a queer paradigm. So I'm really good as a feminist, standing on the shoulders, those who come before me, and the being able to say the word lesbian was hugely important to them. So it's hugely important to me. I'm all good with it. But for the most part, honestly, I just came of age intellectually and politically, in a time in the West Village of ACT UP where, it was all about queer, queer, queer. So in recent years, I've been brought in and asked to do these projects on Jewish lesbian studies. And it's been kind of interesting the way to notice some of my hesitancy, and then to say, oh my gosh, you know what? Like, that would be really interesting. What does that mean today? So anyway, I just want to say that I'm going to be just sort of humble and say I have a lot of confusions, but I do want to say I did commit to doing yet another book on its title, I think its final title is Juicy, Jewish Lesbian Feminisms for the 21st Century, and that should be out this year. And I'm trying to really honor and be grounded in Jewish lesbian feminism that doesn't stay in a kind of 1970s or 80s Jewish lesbian feminism. So both how to honor that. A lot of times what happened is whatever was sort of insufficient about that then got left kind of on the dustbin of history into the queer thing. And some of it maybe should be left on the dustbin of history, and some of it shouldn't. So one of the things I struggled with in that book, which hopefully will be there now for all of you within less than a year, is how to really stay grounded in and honor that Jewish lesbian feminist history, with also, well, what does it make possible for all of us today?
Thank you. And Fred, I don't know if you want to follow up, if there's any points you want to follow up with specifically, but we have time if you want.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. First, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, because I think what it contributes to our university culture is a greater awareness to the ways in which Jewish questions are diversity questions. And I say that in the most broad terms because, of course, students at the university are accustomed to the sense in which they can take courses in Jewish studies and get diversity credit for it. But let's not say that they have the fullest understanding about the ways in which Jewish questions are, again, questions of diversity. And, I guess as someone who has worked on questions of religion and homosexuality for a couple of decades, and these issues with respect to both Christianity and Judaism and Jewish studies and queerness, I think that, at this moment, to kind of pull out some of the thoughts that you have pointed us towards, indigeneity, for instance, as you point out, is such an issue for us to look at. Just giving as an example, a young Reform rabbi at a flagship congregation got into quite a lot of controversy in the summer of 2020 when he stated that Jews were not an indigenous people. And again, that controversy was very much, again, this kind of broader conversation that, we might in the ivory tower know what he means by saying Jews are not indigenous, right? But it means something very different than to translate it, as you said, across to other area studies, and also to translate it more broadly to Jewish conversations within both Jewish studies and the Jewish world more broadly. So I'm really struck by the kind of wonderful consciousness raising that your work can do within the academy as well as outside of it. And I'm grateful for your bringing this perspective to UConn, because I think it's one that we are always trying to bring into our classroom discussions. So thank you, Marla.
Excellent, thank you. And I know that, anyone who's at UConn, you have such amazing resources there to continue. I love to continue talking and working, and I learned so much from all of you, but you have great folks at UConn. It's a tremendous place to be.
Thank you, and thank you, Fred, for adding that as well. I'm going to keep scrolling down to some of the other questions that have come in. So there's one from Catherine Cartwright, who writes in, I personally have never heard this aspect of the Jewish religion, but found it extremely interesting. Do you believe that this topic relating to gender and sex in the Jewish faith is less well known in the United States due to the pressure of Western norms?
Can you say it quickly again for me to try and hear it properly?
Sure. So I'll just read it again. It says that Catherine writes in that I've never heard this aspect of the Jewish religion, but found it interesting. Do you believe that this topic relating to gender and sex in the Jewish faith is less well known in the United States due to the pressure of Western norms? So is there sort of a silencing that takes place in terms of trying to force conformity to heteronormativity that then kind of suppresses knowledge that we might have about a different type of approach to gender and sex in the Jewish faith?
I think that's a great question, and it's actually one of the things I'm loving about it is that it's a bunch of complex questions. Oh, did my video go off? I apologize. Which is of course one of my favorite kind of questions. So there are many ways. So mostly, I don't know how I got where I got intellectually and studied. I mean, I'm first generation colleague. How did I end up with a PhD in political theory and then start doing all this stuff? But mostly my work had long been focused kind of on the US. And when you do US Jewish, you need to look at multiple sources for the constellations of our lives here. But there's definitely, you have to look at Europe. And at the same time, then in a way, I think I and many colleagues, we want to build people's capacities to understand Europe because we're living out so much of European issues. We also have to decenter Europe, of course, in order to really understand anything that we're doing. So we also have to do those two things at the same time. In the US context, we have to learn about Europe and we have to decenter Europe. So in terms of your question, there's so much that is so similar and US folks don't really understand. The way that Jews are constructed racially in Europe is just, it works on a certain kind of register that just gets kind of, gets a little more complicated and sometimes a little more muddied in US politics and understanding. And so knowing a little bit about the European example can help that, even though of course then it's important to understand what's different about it. And the same thing in terms of queer politics and heterosexuality and queer gender norms, the kinds of things that we might learn about in the US, again, very much related to Europe, even as we also absolutely need to decenter Europe. So I would say, and there's just ways, I don't know about other people, there's just ways that European scholars and intellectual conversation, I would say, is like, to use a ridiculous spectrum-y kind of metaphors, light years ahead of what we're able to do in most intellectual discourse in the United States, and in other ways that they're all its own forms of conservatizing paradigms that sometimes folks in the US are able to shake up a little bit. So I think the answer is complicated because in a lovely way, I want to say to you that your question has a lot of components, and that's a beautiful thing. So I don't mean to be skirting the issues. What I wanted to do was try to lay out how one might begin to study your question.
Thank you. And I see, Sherry, you've typed an interesting question in here, and I'll read it, but then please feel free to add on to it. So you write in that, well, Sherry, do you want to just read it?
Sure, thanks, Avi. So I just wanted to thank you, Marla, for this talk. It's been fabulous and also making me think about a whole bunch of things. But I wanted to know, or I guess what I was thinking about is that your talk made me think about the important contributions that Jewish studies makes to anti-racist pedagogy, which is something that a lot of folks around UConn are talking about right now. And I was wondering if you have any advice about how we can better integrate or learn from Jewish studies in these conversations around anti-racist pedagogy, if that makes sense.
Excellent, thank you. And I know you have amazing people there like Lewis and others to do this. So I mean, I want to say the first thing to say is two things that are not actually contradictory, but appear contradictory. On the one hand, we are very much in need in diversity studies and pedagogy in the academy and in the world right now in the US or in the West. We have to hear from multiple voices of multiple marginalized communities. I want to say that without hesitation and complication. And at the same time, in the ways that sometimes Jewishness has been defined out of that conversation, then in my book, we also have to absolutely center Jewish discussions in those discussions. So those, there's a line from Rousseau. I am a political theorist trained in the modern Western political theory, where Rousseau's like, all my ideas are consistent, I just can't say them all at once, right? And like, okay, you know, if I were going to submit an article to a journal and they'd be, you know, I can't say what Rousseau said, like, bear with me, it all works. But I'm going to just ask you, because here we are on Zoom and I can see your faces, like, bear with me because it all works. So what I want to say is that some people fear somehow that having a Jewish conversation amidst a larger diversity conversation somehow sucks up the air for the larger diversity conversation. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we do want to make sure that we're understanding where that fear comes from, to what degree it has bite, and in what degree it's based on a lot of very difficult, problematic stuff. And I also have to say, I've been working in diversity studies for a long time. I've been in the secular academy for a long time in a place that has pretty much no Jewish studies and very few Jewish, like there's not much Jewish going on. So my place is generally diversity studies. And even if I'm in political science or if I'm in women's studies, diversity studies is my grounding at the same time as the Jewish world and Jewish life experience is my grounding. And they so rarely meet. And I would say for the 30 whatever years of my career, what I'm often trying to do is bring them together based on the very presumption that you're making, which is the Jewish studies stuff needs to get better and better at the diversity stuff. And that even though you're going to find tons of Jews in those diversity settings, we still need to get better at it. And the diversity settings need to get so much better with some sort of, awareness and analysis from Jewish life. And as much as people think, oh, I know the word bagel, right? Like, or why might someone give off a holiday or, you know, something, or whatever, like, people think in the United States, and I'm a New Yorker, so it's kind of tough for me, but people think they know things about Jews, but actually in the United States, people know so little about Jews. And that spills over, not even only in nefarious anti-Semitic ways, which we always have to take into account, but it just also spills out into the fact that people know just Jews are a minority, and they actually, most people in the United States know very little about Jews and Jewish life, the construction of Christian, for everyone doing all sorts of diversity studies, Christianity as a dominant, as a hegemonic foundational construct to the problems that we have with identity, oppressions, and justice movements is foundational to our lives. And without taking into account the Christian hegemonic aspects, you just miss so much of what everybody else in diversity studies cares about, whether it's race and class and gender and queerness and transness, etc. So not everybody in Jewish studies pays attention or uses that critical framework of Christian hegemony, but that's part of what I get by being in both worlds, right? I understand the concept of systems and hegemonies, right? And so it's not only about Jewish individuals, and you all know it. You have a thing like, oh, is there personal bias? Is there implicit bias about this individual person, right? I'm a theorist. Of course I care about individuals, but you know, what a lot of us are trying to do, particularly those of us who pay our rent through the academy, you know, through working in the academy, is we're trying to think through systems, right? And that's some of what we do. And that gets lost a lot when people don't know how to integrate a systemic Jewish analysis into the work that a lot of us are doing, or they don't know how to integrate anti-Jewish oppression in a systemic way into our discussions of oppressions in their specificities and in their overarching structures and institutions. I hope that was good enough for now, because I know that we should be talking about that for a long time.
Thank you. And I think I'm really glad you brought that up, Sherry, because it's such a fascinating and relevant point. Although as Marla's work sort of points to, one of the useful aspects of applying this sort of this lens that you've been talking about is deconstructing these sort of simple binaries, right? And complicating, and as Lewis writes in his comments, also complicating some of these identity issues. And so as you alluded to earlier on in your talk, even if we think about this question about Jewishness and whiteness and sort of a tendency to construct binaries of either black or white, one of the things that you point out is that this is another frame where the lens of the Jew as queer completely complicates that as well, and points to that it's not so simple, which I think also can help us as we think about some of this anti-racism work as well.
Exactly. And, you know, like I said, on the one hand, people who do intersectionality and diversity work, on the one hand, the whole point is that they're, you know, we're all better or worse, and, you know, we have our good days and we have our bad days, but in using multiple paradigms. And then sometimes it's like, add the Jewish, oh, can't handle that. That one's too complicated. But every paradigm, the point is it's supposed to complicate our narratives. If you didn't take into account Latinx populations, if you didn't take into account indigeneity, right? Like, then your analysis isn't just going to be partial, it's going to be wrong, right? And once you start, you're going to find lots of complexities. And sometimes that's going to be like, oh, what have I gotten myself into? And sometimes, you know, that's of course what the beauty is. And so when you add the Jewish, and it becomes surprising to a lot of people, because even to Jewish studies folks, right? Because we have a lot we need to learn from each other. Like when you add the Jewish, it's like, oh, I had no idea I was getting myself in for that one, right? Like, but that is the point. That's not a reason to exclude the Jewish. That's a reason for, you know, why we want to bring that in, just like we want to bring in the trans, why we want to bring in the class, why we want to bring in all the other parts. Because their point is, the concept of diversity studies is when you bring in previously excluded aspects or people, when you bring new people or aspects in new ways, you're not just gonna, you all know this, you don't just get more people. It shakes things up and you get new paradigms. And that's what excites me, right? And I know it is a draw for many of you. Right. And so what don't we want to have our paradigms complicated and renewed? You know, I think we're all here because we do.
I think we all agree. And this is what makes this work so fascinating. I want to, a few people have asked about the recording. So we are indeed recording the program. We're going to make sure that it's sort of processed well and came out well. So feel free to be in touch with me directly, you know, about getting access to it. We're going to make sure that it came out well. My email address is avinoam.pat@uconn.edu. It's interesting to your point about sort of both the importance of doing this work and applying this lens of Jewish queer and sort of what diversity studies is actually supposed to be about. There's something that strikes me. So I just came from the class that I was teaching, is my Jewish humor class, which I was just teaching before now. And it's great because
why are we all in your class? That sounds great.
No, but one of the interesting sort of frames that we use in this class is not just to look at sort of disproportionate or overrepresentation of Jews and production of comedy and humor, especially in the American context, but also this, actually the lens that you're looking at, like what is the role of outsiders or people who perceive themselves as outsiders, who both participate in a culture, are both in and outside, to apply a critical lens and framework that does sort of lend to the creation of humor, the production of comedy. And I'm not just talking about Jews, I'm talking about all sorts of marginalized groups, immigrant groups who do. There are cycles of this that happen in the American context in particular, where you can see waves of who is represented. And I think, to me, it strikes me it'd be really interesting to take the lens that you're doing in terms of sort of the Jewish queer and apply it specifically to humor studies, which hopefully is a growing field. Yeah. All right, I want to thank you. This has been really, really fascinating. It's such a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you so much, Sherry Zane, for helping spearhead this program and this invitation. And I want to thank Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program for helping to sponsor this program, and thank our co-sponsors, UConn Hillel, the Philosophy Department, Political Science Department, and the Rainbow Center for being co-sponsors for this program, along with the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. Really amazing, fascinating, thought-provoking. Thank you so much to Dr. Marla Brettschneider. Sherry, thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
No, thank you, Avi. Thank you for moderating, and Marla for being here, and for all of you for Zooming in. I know everyone is Zoomed out, but I'm glad that you showed up today. So thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Be well, stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody in person soon.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.